it's always a good sign for the quality of our events if our staff bring their spouses. That just means we're clearly on the right track. And so what we're going to do is we're going to have a little bit of a conversation at the beginning. Rachel and I, so I'm going to say a few words to introduce her, and then we do a bit of a Q&A. And then the report, so our main subject is the Global Index on Responsible AI that Rachel and the Global Center for AI Governance that she founded put out, and that's a bit of a technical subject, so Rachel will do a 20-slide presentation on that, and then after that we're going to have a shared conversation. So just a little bit of background. So Rachel actually does a fascinating combination of things. She has a background in human rights, she has a background also in philosophy, she has a background in policy advising, specifically in the African context, advising the African Union and assessing efforts of the African Union around formulating AI policy, also distinctly with the goal of bringing Africa more firmly on the map of AI thinking at the global level, for the rest of the world to pay more attention to Africa, for Africa also to grow more strongly in the AI domain, enormously important task given the substantial population growth that that is predicted for Africa over the next several decades. Rachel herself, not from Africa, but now based in South Africa, based in Cape Town. So this think tank, the Global Center for AI Governance that she founded, is based in Africa, looks at Africa in a way first and foremost, but the report, the Global Index on Responsible AI, the first ever of its kind, obviously is called the Global Index for a reason. So this is an assessment of the global situation, so much beyond Africa. So first of all, please give Rachel a round of applause for being with us. And maybe Rachel, you could tell us a little bit about your background and how you ended up working on AI questions.
Yeah, well, thank you, and it's such a great pleasure to be here. Thank you all for coming. Yeah, my background is very much in human rights. I had an undergraduate in English literature and philosophy, and then moved to South Africa in 2008 to work at the South African Human Rights Commission, and then went on to do a master's in international human rights law. And then while I was working at the South African Human Rights Commission, I began work towards a PhD on the concept of transparency. And I was very interested in these big ideas that were shaping the world, and what work some of these words were doing. And quite quickly that's what led to my work in AI, because transparency was at that point the kind of key ethical principle for managing what was then the major quandary of AI black boxes, which doesn't seem to be as much of the most major concern we're facing now, partly because I think the systems have become so very complex. But I did a postdoc in 2018 at the University of London, which was the only time in the last 16 years I've been outside of South Africa. And AI was becoming a really significant policy area. The UK was grappling with what are the policy choices we need to make to get ahead of this technology and to get ahead globally. And the US and China were starting to position themselves in this, well, what's now very much a kind of out-and-out AI arms race. And I think my concern was very much that African countries were not part of this conversation. And so I came back to South Africa and began a series of quite large research projects, I suppose this one being the largest. First of all, to try and understand and explore from different disciplines the impacts and implications of AI for African societies, which very much fell under the work of what we call the African Observatory on Responsible AI, which is a project funded by the International Development Research Center of Canada, IDRC, and others over time. But the objective of the African Observatory is to really accelerate African research on artificial intelligence, particularly around the ethics and the governance, and to raise the visibility, I suppose, and the uptake of African expertise in global debates and decision making, which were not adequately, and which are still not adequately reflective of African priorities or needs. And then these research projects I eventually kind of brought into this research institution we established called the Global Center on AI Governance. And that was a really deliberate naming. For a long time we thought, let's call it the African Observatory on Responsible AI, because we are an African research institute, Pan-African research institute. We primarily work with African policymakers, and we work with universities across the continent on courses on AI and human rights in Africa and AI ethics and policy in Africa. But this big project, which we'll talk about, the Global Index, covers 138 countries and jurisdictions. It really is the largest study that's been done on responsible AI to date, and it includes 41 African countries, which is really, really significant. We're filling major data gaps. But we realized that, one, we were doing global work and we should claim it. And I think it's important to have centers of excellence based on the African continent that are speaking into global debates, and that have ideas that are globally relevant and globally important. And I think very often we establish research institutions in the West and call them global centers without questioning their global relevance. So we really wanted to kind of make a point. And I think, we are doing something incredibly global with studies like this. I think we have 9 countries in the Caribbean. We have pretty much every country in Latin America, save Venezuela. We have the majority of Southeast Asia. We're missing some countries in Europe, but we can talk about which countries we have and which countries we don't. And that's largely a question of where we had networks. And I suppose to an extent where we had funding, because each country, of course, was another, however much the consultant who completed the research was. So yeah, I think I'll pause there.
Let me just ask you one other thing before turning over then to the presentation. Sure. So I know one of the themes of your thinking about AI is also decolonizing AI. Can you fill in the audience a bit on what that is about, decolonizing AI?
Yeah, so I have a book coming out next month in the UK, although it's only coming out in January in the US, called The New Empire of AI, The Future of Global Inequality. And that's looking at the inequalities which AI is sharpening, and the relationship between these inequalities and colonialism, particularly, of course, European colonialism. So I'd written an article called Can We Decolonize AI a number of years ago, and that was, I suppose, the beginning of what this book was, but this book is much more geared towards a public readership and trying to invite many more people into the conversation. But it's really, I think the approach with the idea of decolonizing AI is, first of all, to assess the ways in which and identify the ways in which colonial structures of power or ideas about racial categorization and racial oppression continue to be put to work through AI technologies. And then to think about how do we abolish them, and how do we seek justice. And then the third part is what are the new kinds of worlds and ways of living together that we want to build. So that's kind of the decolonial framing that I use and that's brought through in the book.
Excellent. Why don't you just fill us in on the report now, and then we'll open it up.
Okay, I'm going to sit down because I have a fractured foot that is healing all too slowly. If that's okay. So I will talk you through this study, and I think, it's important to kind of preface this piece of work to say I'm not a quantitative sociologist. At the point in time when this study, I was approached to lead this study, which I suppose is interesting because at the time I was really kind of publishing on decoloniality and technology and gender and AI, and then the Canadian government approached me to say, would you lead a study on measuring responsible AI? So of course, first of all, I was like, I don't want to measure anything, that's so normative, help me. And then the idea of responsible AI was not a kind of determined category which we all agreed upon in 2021, which is when this study kind of first came to me. But I suppose what interested me was the idea of creating something that was truly global, and assessing a global condition from an African research center seemed to me something really, really powerful. So the first year was spent largely panicking on how do we do this. We did a lot of consultations with groups around the world to understand what we couldn't from the literature. So how do different groups, feminist organizations, indigenous groups, people from Francophone Africa or Latin America, places where we'd not got a set of articulated principles from the OECD or a set of kind of literature reviews that examine different frameworks for ethical AI. What do they see as the ethical challenges that AI poses to their societies, and therefore what do they take responsible AI, what do they feel like responsible AI should mean? And that expanded our definition a little bit. It expanded it from kind of ideas of transparency and accountability and privacy to thinking about socioeconomic rights and labor rights, environmental issues, redress and remedy. The human rights framing was something, because this was a study funded by government, Global Affairs Canada, and the IDRC in Canada. The human rights framing was almost like a given. It was something that was kind of really important from the beginning. But as somebody that had studied and explored and interpreted and practiced human rights in parts of the world where there's different articulations of human rights, it's not necessarily that there's a Western view versus an African view, but in the African context, there's an articulation of community rights, and other kinds of rights hold as much value as civil and political rights. So socioeconomic rights, children's rights, rights of future generations. And so we kind of had this very expansive idea of human rights as we went into this. But establishing a measurement framework for a set of unstable, highly contested, qualitative ideas was of course complex, and of course we've not got it 100% perfect. We are writing up an article on our kind of process of thinking and determination. There was a lot of decisions that went into why we went one way or another, and sometimes it had to be a question of, is this measurable, rather than, is this the perfect ideal we think we should be working towards. So maybe I should just open it here because my eyes are not strong enough to see what's on the screen there. Just to kind of give an overview, I suppose, of what we were trying to do. Our objective was to understand where countries were in terms of responsible AI, so what commitments they'd made. And really, I think the value is assessing this over time and seeing what progress there was to be made. In 2021, when we started out, I think there was one African country with an AI policy, and AI strategies and policies were really just emerging around the world. And I think in some ways it was potentially too early to start kind of measuring progress and commitments over time. But I think by the time we did data collection, which was in 2023, there was a lot to measure, and we found some really, really interesting things. And I think when we go into data collection in 2025, I think that's where we're going to start to see really interesting progress. So our objectives were firstly to kind of measure this set of, measure the idea of responsible AI through trying to translate them into a set of human rights-based benchmarks. We wanted to assess the kind of country conditions to support and promote responsible AI, and I'm not sure we really got that. I think we assessed a number of things, and I'm going to kind of talk you through what we assessed, but those kind of conditions for ensuring responsible AI. I think we only addressed and measured some of them, and I'm hoping we do much more in the second edition. We wanted very much to provide much better evidence to multilateral institutions. The UN is, of course, doing a lot now on thinking about global governance of AI. But we wanted to provide much better evidence to decision makers about where we're at and where the major capacity gaps lie. A lot of the countries where we collected evidence, there'd really been very, very little, if any evidence at all about what kind of activities or governance tools they had regarding anything associated with AI. So I think we've done something really major in covering the extent of countries that we have. And then, of course, what ultimately we're trying to do is support the realization of responsible AI. And I had one Secretary of State on AI, I won't say which country, but afterwards, after this was published, it come up to me and say, call for an in-person meeting to tell me all the things that they've done to advance responsible AI and kind of increase their position on the index for the second edition. So I think, indexes do play an important role, whether it's called naming and shaming. I don't want to think of it as that, maybe more kind of gently encouraging or motivating countries to try and do better, but that's very much part of what it does, because it's supposed to be something that's really an accessible set of evidence, really kind of easy to understand for much more than just researchers, but especially journalists and especially policymakers, to get a kind of rapid fire understanding of where their country's at and in relation to their countries in their regions or countries in similar contexts. So this really was a big study. So we did 138 countries and jurisdictions. We had 140. We lost 2 countries because the data quality was not good enough to keep in the end. We went through a really rigorous process of data quality assurance. And I'm going to talk through the things we actually measured. And we measured we collected data on far more than what we measured, but were unable to keep all of it because the data quality was not at a stage where it was adequate to be fairly assessed between different countries. We recruited 140 experts from all these different countries, and then a group of global reviewers that was representative of all the regions in the world to review the data. We also have 15 partner organizations from around the world, largely from the majority world research institutions that are leading on AI governance research, and they recruited the researchers in their region, and they provided the first round of data quality review before it went to our global team of reviewers, before it was spot checked by our internal team. The data collection alone we did a pilot study in 2023, so it took us a long time to kind of design this thing. It came to us in the kind of idea of the study came in July 2021, but I had a baby and took some time off during 2022, in which time we tried to figure out how do we actually design the conceptual framework for a global index. How do we do this very complicated task of measuring responsible AI? And then in 2023, at the beginning of that year, we did a pilot study with all our partner organizations. So they collected the data on their particular country where they were based, and that formed the pilot study. And then we realized that we had a ridiculously long questionnaire, because it was an expert questionnaire that these researchers in all these different countries filled out. But it was a questionnaire that took them like 3 months to complete and was really deadly boring. And so the longer the questions, the less accurate the data might be. So in the end, we had to kind of really figure out what questions were slightly superfluous and that we didn't need to be asking. And then data collection began in earnest in September 23, ended in early 2024. There was about 3 months of data quality control, which was a lot of backwards and forwards, and then we launched the report in June 2024. So I'll just kind of talk you through, this was in the end the definition that we landed on, which is quite a broad definition of responsible AI, and from this definition we pull out what was in the end 19 specific measurement areas. So we defined it as the design, development and deployment and governance of AI in ways that respects and protects all human rights and upholds the principles of AI ethics through every stage of the AI lifecycle and value chain. I don't think we got there in determining every stage of the AI lifecycle and value chain. We had questions on this that had to come out because it was something that was quite tricky to measure in different contexts. So we're trying to think about how do we create a better measurement framework that does assess these things in the second edition. And then it requires all actors involved in the national AI ecosystem to take responsibility for the human, social and environmental impacts of their decisions. And we do measure far more than what just the government is doing. So one of the interesting things that we measure, and I'll talk through it, is the activities of non-state actors, which was universities, questionably not non-state, but universities and academia, civil society organisations and private actors, as well as what governments were doing. And then we had here the responsible design, deployment and governance of AI proportionate to the purpose of its use and meet the technological needs of the individuals and societies it seeks to serve. Again, this was something that came up as really, really important when we were designing it. And in terms of how we got in the measurement, I'm not sure we quite got there, but what we did find out, and this is the conceptual framework, which I hope you can see, and I'll talk you through it, but this is the 19 thematic areas that we assessed. We collected data on 29 thematic areas. So we had other thematic areas. So we have here the 3 dimensions that we split these thematic areas up into, just as a way of clustering them. So we had responsible AI capacities, which includes competitions authorities, public sector, skills development and international cooperation. We had under here oversight institutions, but when we collected the data, we realised that so many of these oversight institutions were not independent of government and therefore were questionable in one way or another, and were not necessarily demonstrative of responsible AI capacity. And so in the end, we had to not score that thematic area. We had, then we have the second clustering, which is on human rights and AI, where we've got gender equality, data protection and privacy, public participation and awareness, bias and unfair discrimination, children's rights, labour protection and the right to work, and cultural and linguistic diversity. Under here, we also had health, education and environment, and this is where that kind of is the use of AI proportionate to the needs question came from. And when we were consulting with groups in the beginning, they were saying, you know, if AI can help advance access to healthcare or education, or help protect the environment, and therefore is supporting the protection of human rights. And I think there's a very interesting argument when you think about socioeconomic rights and the obligation to use maximum available resources for the progressive realization of these rights. And you think about, what is AI a available resource, because it doesn't just mean financing. Is it an available resource that states should be using if it genuinely can advance the realization of these rights? But when we collected the evidence on this, I think the way, because all the researchers in all these different countries had this very long handbook where each of these thematic areas was nicely defined, and we provided them with like examples of the kind of evidence we were looking for and the kind of evidence we were not looking for. But for education, health and environment, there was just a whole load of policies from governments who are using AI in these sectors and not necessarily in a way that was inclusive or responsible or human rights based. And so again, we had to not score all of that very interesting data. And then the third cluster was responsible AI governance, where we had national AI policies, impact assessments, human oversight and determination, responsibility and accountability, proportionality and do no harm, public procurement, transparency and explainability, access to remedy and redress, and safety, accuracy and reliability. And so across all these thematic areas, all these 19 thematic areas, they were split up into 3 measurement areas. The first was we were measuring the existence of a government framework. So is there a law or a policy that demonstrates executive intent or something more legally binding that relates directly to this issue. So many of the issues were covered under national AI policy. So you would find the same piece of evidence being used across multiple thematic areas. The second thing we were checking was government action. So this was a proxy for implementation, but we were asking, has the government led any initiatives? Have they funded something? Have they supported the establishment of an expert panel? Have they held a conference? Have they supported training programs? Have they done something in this area that shows that they know it's an issue, or they know it's something they need to be doing something on? And then the third thing we were assessing is is there a non-state actor initiative that points to some kind of national level capacity to deal with or understand this issue, even if it's outside of the state. This is quite hard to kind of measure comparatively. So when it got to the weighting, and I can't speak as well as my colleague who really kind of leads the quantitative side of this, but when it came to the weighting, I believe government frameworks and government actions weighed the same, and then non-state actors weighed like 10%. So they weighed much less because, it was very hard to, you can't just pull out one civil society group and say it's representative of the whole country. There were some other reasons why it was not something that should be kind of placed too much emphasis on, but it was a really, really important set of evidence that we found. So, for example, on the African continent, we found hundreds of universities working on these issues, or hundreds of civil society groups, and all these different initiatives. And, that kind of database then enables us to start bringing together these different groups, or provides a basis for where there is existing capacity that should be further supported. So that was really interesting evidence to collect. This, I can't speak as well as my colleague Nico can on this, but effectively we used a set of secondary data inputs as coefficients on the country scores. So in effect, we wanted to take into account, in some ways, the ways in which our index did not take into account actual human rights-based harms or AI misuse, and then the degree to which a kind of AI policy or a governance tool may be effective within a country. So we had some coefficients that looked at regulatory quality and rule of law for government frameworks. So for that kind of pillar of evidence, we had on government actions, we had a coefficient which was data on control of corruption and government effectiveness. And then on non-state actors, for that pillar of evidence, we had one on freedom of expression and belief, and one on associational and organizational rights. So these were other indexes where the score would kind of go up or down by 25% depending on where the country scored on one of these other indexes. So I'm going to talk through the key findings. All of this is available at AI, and there's a comprehensive report that you can download, and I realise I'm taking quite long, but we're going to skip through these findings. So effectively, the majority of the world is living in places where there are not adequate mechanisms to ensure that their human rights are protected from AI misuse. So this kind of demonstrates the range of where countries sat in terms of scoring. So you can see there are, I think it's like 7 or 8 countries that are the dark blue that represent 101 million people. And those are the countries that did very well and scored between 75 and 100. It's really interesting to look at the scoring because there's a couple of countries that do really well, and then like countries that came like 5th or 6th on the index start getting scores in like the 60s. The mean score was 19 out of 100. So when we talk about responsible AI, it's still an idea. Well, we can be polite and say it's emergent, or we can say it's kind of an abstract ideal at the moment and only certain countries are taking it seriously. So then the countries that score between 50 and 75 points, which represents 729 million people, are those in the purple, and then the white and the like light green, which together represent, my maths is not so great, but I think that's like 2.8 billion people scored, between under 50. So the majority of countries were scoring, I suppose, between 25 and 50, and as I said, the mean score was under 20, so it was really, really quite shocking. So some of the kind of specific points that we found was that a lot of countries had national AI strategies, but they didn't necessarily contain provisions for responsible AI, and the countries that really did well had kind of comprehensive governance frameworks that addressed the human rights considerations of AI. One of the things I suppose we were really concerned about is the lack of mechanisms to protect human rights at risk. So the blue shows countries without any government frameworks in these areas, like the dark blue. It's not actually the best graph to view. And then the light blue shows countries with frameworks. So, for example, access to redress and remedy, there were 103 countries that had nothing, and there was 35 countries that had something. Or impact assessments, 95 countries without any provisions on AI impact assessments, and 43 with. And then the other one we were looking at for thinking about AI use in the public services and public sector was public procurement. And there was 114 countries without any kind of provisions on fair, sustainable, inclusive public procurement processes for AI services used within the public sector, and 24 with. We also found that some of the kind of key issues around inclusion were some of the lowest performing thematic areas overall. So these are some of the lowest performing thematic areas across the board, which are bias and unfair discrimination, children's rights, cultural and linguistic diversity. I think gender equality was potentially, I think it was like in the bottom 3 of, which is really sad. You know, it's really something that is not being taken seriously by most countries. And then labour protection, right to work was also something that scored really low. Where you see that high green bar, that is because this shows the different evidence, the different pillars of evidence. So the dark blue shows government frameworks, the light blue shows government actions, and then the green shows non-state actors. So you can see in all these kind of inclusion-related issues, gender, children, labour, it's the non-state actors, it's particularly civil society groups that are kind of bringing up their country's performance and kind of national capacity on these issues. I'm not going to go into this one too much because I don't think it's that interesting, but we can always come back to it. This is a little bit more information on workers' rights, which is effectively only 33 governments have frameworks addressing workers' rights not to be subject to surveillance, or the rights of workers working in the gig economy, sort of working directly with AI, but only seven of them were enforceable. This was, of course, something that was particularly important to those countries that are really taking this kind of safety and security issue as a big thing, and we found that globally only 25% of countries had frameworks to ensure the technical integrity of AI systems, so that's extremely worrying. Lots of work to be done. I've talked a little bit about this, but the long and short of it, apart from that they're kind of filling gaps, is that we found over 500 university and academic institutions working on these issues, and researchers were only able to show, I think it was a maximum of 3 per country, so this is a really kind of representative number. 400 civil society organisations and 350 plus private sector actors, so innovators kind of working on some of these issues. Gender equality was of course something that we were very concerned about, and this is the report we did is very, very high level. The second report that we have coming out is a deep dive on gender, particularly gender in the majority world. So we're going to really explore the data we have. We have another report coming out on human rights and AI in the majority world that does a deep dive into some of the specific human rights issues. But yes, this was something that performed very badly. So 24 countries had a framework that mentioned gender-related issues and AI, but 54 countries we found evidence of civil society initiatives and 45 academic initiatives on these issues, which is not actually that many if we think, you know, how aware we are as academic research institutions of this problem, to find only 45 countries with academic institutions addressing this issue or exploring this issue or having published something is really not a lot. Cultural and linguistic diversity, and this is my last slide, was something that, especially with the advent of generative AI, has become really important. But again, was something where there was very little being done from a government level. So 19% of countries had a framework, and 22% of countries there was some kind of government-initiated activity on this. But 52% of countries had non-state actors engaging on how AI can be used to promote cultural and linguistic diversity, and then how cultural and linguistic diversity can be promoted within AI. So I will pause there, and that's just a taster.
So I'm just going to open up to your questions right now. I just want to say we are recording this event because we are eager to get the word out about this report. So more likely than not, we're going to post this on the web for this reason. So for that reason also, normally I would ask you to identify yourself, and it would still be, even if you want to do that, it would still be appreciated. But since we are recording, I'm not asking you to, and even if I know you, I will just point at you and not call you by name, so that you really are on the record only if you want to be on the record. So, but with that said, it sounded too bombastically formal, but with that said, yes. Do we need mics, or do we?
She needs to steal yours.
Oh, okay.
Hello, thank you very much. Well, first, I can help with the Venezuelan thing, so yeah.
Oh, amazing.
And second, so this is a question about the different ways of the different actors, especially, I'm thinking like United States, right? I mean, the way that ChatGPT, OpenAI and these companies have, right? So, how do you tackle that issue when, like, you have these massive companies that can have more impact than even the regulation itself, right? Because the way OpenAI operates doesn't affect just the United States, affects also all the rest of the world that uses ChatGPT now. So I wanted to understand, like, how do you think, if this tackles this and in which way, and how do you think in the future this impact can be measured?
Oh, I can answer. Yeah, so it's a very good question. I think when we were starting out, we were really cognizant that so many of the harms are being caused by these big tech actors, and what we'd really like to be doing is holding them to account. But as time went on, we realized that our study was really about national level capacity commitments and progress. And ideally, what we want to see is every country in the world establishing some kind of legal framework that meaningfully holds these countries to account, and we would be measuring that. And I hope in time, one of the things that we will be trying to measure is the effectiveness of these frameworks. That's very hard to do. So we didn't measure the impact. I mean, there's two things to talk about in terms of impact. One is the impact, the human rights related impact of AI systems in any given country, whether positive or negative. Very hard to do. We could potentially think about measuring the number of cases received by a national human rights institution or something like that, but that kind of makes a whole load of assumptions about that institution working on these issues, people knowing about them. It's just a very hard thing to measure, and I'm very open to anybody who has ideas about how we do measure impact. I think the impact that we really are interested in, and we think potentially would fall within our scope, is to measure the impact of governance frameworks. Again, very, very difficult to do. And so, what we ended up measuring was government-led initiatives and activities that we could use as a proxy for implementing some of these laws or frameworks. But again, I think there's more that we could do. So yeah, very, very open to suggestions and very happy to extend our network in Latin America.
And we're expecting the Venezuela data to be handled today.
I have a question about for your respondents to the research. Did you give them an idea of what, because I think a lot of people, when they think of AI, one person may think about visual AI, another will think about ChatGPT, others will be thinking about the systems that have been existent for a long time now. How did you collect those insights and apply that to the data and the responses?
Yeah, very good question. So we did, this active recruitment of AI policy specialists in every single country. So they had to have kind of clear experience of having worked on AI policy. We spent 3 weeks training everybody online. We trained, 150 researchers on precisely our definitions of all these different issues or terms that we were using. And then we had a researcher's handbook that was translated into 5 different languages, which provided, these definitions of everything, but also went through every single thematic area and provided guidance to the researchers on exactly how we understood this issue, how we wanted them to collect data, what kind of data we would accept, what kind of evidence. We also, provided guidance on where to look for evidence. I think we had an incredible global group of researchers, and we're really kind of thinking about how do we support this incredibly interesting network of people. I hope that answers your question.
So thank you for your presentation today. Quick question, well, maybe not quick, we'll see. So if we go back to your definition of responsible AI, I think I was trying to write it down, but but I didn't get everything down. But it seems that trust is implied, maybe explainability, even though I'm not a fan of that word, or justification may be implied. So I'd like to know your thoughts on explainability of large language models, especially as we move to agentic AI, where we're combining many, many models together, and whether you think that's actually something that will be able to be explained.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I go backwards and forwards on this one. So I think people have a right to know what technologies are being used on them, particularly when it results in a decision being made about them. I also think these things are incredibly complicated to explain. I think we need more people who have a sense of whether they agree with it or not, and can enter into debates and discussion about these models and what they're doing. And I think it's particularly important in areas in which I work to increase public literacy around AI. But then I sometimes think, should people, with something like nuclear energy, which is often a kind of comparison point on AI, should people be able to explain how a nuclear power plant works, or nuclear fission? Should people be spending their time trying to understand this? Or should experts be able to take accountability or be responsible for kind of providing the key information to people so that they can concentrate on what's important to them, and trust that their governments in particular are kind of ensuring this issue does not harm them? And I go backwards and forwards, so I don't think I'm sure of what I think on either side yet.
Thank you so much for your presentation. And my question is specifically about Africa. Because something you mentioned is that most of the groups, they are non-state actors that actually kind of lead and pave the way in the responsible AI adoption. And when we know that there are still many countries also that still lack just basic data privacy laws or regulations, my question is really in terms, how do you feel these non-state actors can actually influence governments in terms of really adopting? Because it's not just a matter of having written regulations or laws, but enacting them also and really taking actions. So do you see this kind of conversation happening? Because so far I feel it's not yet.
Yeah, that's a very good point. And when I was trying to think about the reasons why we had such a low weighting on non-state actors, it was actually very much for that reason, is that there are a lot of countries where they have very, very limited influence. We were specifically looking at national-based non-state actors. So we weren't looking at kind of foreign actors working within a country. We were looking at sort of civil society organizations within countries. What is really, really interesting to do, especially for the African region, is to look at the countries that score highly on the non-state actors pillar generally, and there's countries that score highly in other regards. So South Africa, for example, comes up top in the region in Africa, and they don't have many governance frameworks at all. They have foundational laws that are really important, but they don't have a national AI policy, for example. They're not leading in that regard on the continent. What they have is a really robust civil society and academic sector that's really engaging across all these different domains. So, I think in a number of African countries, it's quite telling when there isn't many civil society groups engaging on these issues. But I also, because I think there's a number of really important things you're pointing to here, and in the second edition, so what we really want to do in the second round is examine more closely institutions. So I'm thinking about institutions of democracy, like national human rights institutions, competitions commissions. Yes, we have, but we want to pull out institutions that are active within each different thematic area, because they play a really important role often in being that middle ground between governments and civil society, when governments feel that civil society is really antagonistic and there's, real lack of trust between civil society groups and governments. So yeah, we're quite cognizant of this, and definitely go and look at the scores, because they're really interesting.
Hi, I kept thinking about the skills development piece that you named, and I was thinking about if governments are working out their frameworks, their AI frameworks, for instance, are you able to measure and do consultations within, for instance, K through 12 systems and these education pillars that are going to form next generations? Is there a connect between government or even non-state actors, universities, et cetera? Are you measuring this, and how are you measuring it, I guess? How are you accessing that information?
So how are we measuring not just public, because what we measured was public sector skills development, which was, is there provisions to provide civil servants with training on responsible AI related issues, and then how far is this actually being implemented? And then we'd had something on education, which ended up being non-scoring. So I think I might be missing your question a little bit.
Just more how governments, how the education systems are preparing their next generations to engage with AI. That's
I suppose we didn't assess that. I know there have been some studies that are exploring how different countries are preparing national science systems for AI, which covers kind of higher education at least. But I suppose you could look at curricula, you could look at number of graduates, and I know that's been done on more technical AI-related issues. I think the Stanford Index covers maybe number of graduates or something. But we would be looking around trainings and education on responsible AI specifically. So I think there's quite a lot of emphasis on this one. So I'm hoping we'll have a more robust engagement with it in the second edition.
Let's take one last question.
Hi Rachel, this is an amazing website. I was just skimming through the data and I'm looking forward to read the report. One thing that came to my mind was that sometimes the choice of not legislating on the subject becomes very strategic. Two reasons that come on the top of my head is, one is that it may not be on your radar. For example, only 37% of the population in Africa actually has access to internet, and that's including narrowband. We don't even mean 4G or 5G speeds. And the second could be, if you have more stake in the innovation, you would be more reticent to not legislate on it. To give you an example, when the EU AI Act discourse was happening, the two countries that actually threw a spanner in the works were Germany and France because of Anthropic and Mistral.
Yeah.
So they wanted those carve-outs. So, and because EU has such a strict law, they don't have access to the most cutting-edge models that are coming out right now. So in that sense, would you say that the focus on legislating on responsible AI is a bit disproportionate right now?
So we didn't focus on legislation, we focused on frameworks, and we didn't make a difference in scoring in terms of, we assessed whether they were binding or not, but we didn't make it a normative requirement that countries that had binding legislation on these issues performed better. What we were looking for is some kind of executive intent or commitment to assessing or kind of providing some kind of governance oversight or policy tool on these issues. So, I mean, having worked with, my personal opinion, having worked with a number of innovators across the African continent, there's a huge difference between policy and governance that creates enabling conditions for safe innovation, inclusive innovation to flourish, innovation that serves a country and serves the development needs of a country, and then regulation that has really costly compliance, like we might see in the EU. And when we talk about governance, it's actually an umbrella for all of that. So we have to start getting specific. And I think a lot of innovators that I've worked with want some kind of assurance that they're doing the right thing. They want governments to, where governments have bought into what they're developing, they're able to scale better. And I think certainly in the health space, we will be looking at regulation. I think that will be really, really important. So yeah, I think that's a varied issue, but we didn't insist on binding law for many of these issues. Just one last point. In terms of kind of levels of adoption and what you would expect in terms of governance, yes, there is kind of a internet issue across much of Africa, but we're also seeing kind of social media as really globally pervasive. So I think the exposure within any given country to AI technologies is there, but we really recognise this in the report, and we were saying, yes, the score is really low, but in some ways that is to be expected because this is not a policy and regulatory priority for every country yet. But that's where I think the longitudinal study, and we start getting progressive data that shows our progress over time, is going to become really, really interesting, because I think the way things are moving, countries around the world will be adopting policies and will be needing to adopt governance tools, and even those countries where there's kind of nothing there at the moment, I think that's going to change over the next few years, and I think that's going to be really interesting to track, and I hope we're ahead of it.
So I suppose for a truly Herculean effort like this, where you are now is something like the end of the beginning, right? You put out the first edition, and now we need to see how this goes on. For indices like this to have a relevance in the world, as they need to be continued, and of course they also need to spread, right? So naming and shaming works so people actually know what's going on. So we're going to definitely put this out. So as Carr Center, and I hope if you find this persuasive, you'll also just put it out there, so that over time this will be as well known as maybe something like the Corruption Perception Index that Transparency International puts out there. And then I think this will be a very important contribution to making the world a better place with artificial intelligence. Thank you very much, Rachel.